Well, thank you all for coming. It's a great turnout tonight, and thank you, Congressman Goldwater, for the very inspiring presentation and the encouragement to us all. We have one last very special guest. Thomas E. Woods, Jr. is a senior fellow in history at the Mises Institute. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard and his master's of philosophy and PhD from Columbia University. His books include 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, and Meltdown, which gives a free market look at the causes of our current financial crisis. Woods' writing has appeared in dozens of popular and scholarly periodicals, and in 2006, Dr. Woods was the recipient of the $50,000 first prize in the 2006 Templeton Enterprise Awards for his book, The Church and the Market. And now here tonight to discuss his most recent book, Nullification, How to Resist Federal Tyranny in the 21st Century, please help me welcome Dr. Tom Woods.
Well, thank you. I'm always the shortest guy at these things. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Very, very glad to be here. At first I thought, the Fargo Air Museum, what an odd place to have an event. Now, I withdraw that statement. This is the most awesome place for an event I've ever been to. Incredible. I've been all over the country talking about this subject, and this is the second time I've had a chance to come to North Dakota, my first trip to Fargo, and so glad to be here. In fact, I was in the process of making my connecting flight here to Fargo. I was at the Denver airport, and suddenly somebody yells out, "Tom!" I turned my head. It's Barry Goldwater Jr. And I thought, man, what an interesting turn my life has taken, that Barry Goldwater is calling to me in an airport. And so I went over to him just in awe, and I said, "Barry Goldwater Jr." And immediately everybody looks at him like, oh my gosh, it is Barry Goldwater. I mean, he looks exactly like his father. Now, the poor guy, he's a wonderful man in his own right. He had a distinguished congressional career in his own right, so we don't want the poor guy living in his father's shadow all the time. However, I am tempted to go up to him and say, look, I got these thick black rimmed glasses. Just put them on. I just got to see what this would look like. But he's a very good sport about this. It's very kind of him to say that he is honored to be in my presence, when of course it's just the opposite. I'm honored to be in the presence of a man like him. Before coming up here tonight, over dinner, I had a couple of glasses of wine. You may think that's not particularly newsworthy. However, you're neglecting the fact that I have the alcohol tolerance level of a 90-year-old woman. So who knows? Who knows what we're in for tonight? Figured might as well make it interesting. I've already been to North Dakota. I got to do something a little bit more interesting for the second time, so who knows what's going to happen. What I want to talk about tonight is some topics related to this book of mine, Nullification. And I've got a bit of an uphill battle ahead of me, perhaps not with you folks in this room, but I'm going to be taking some unpopular positions, but yet arguing for them vigorously. And I hope people who agree with me and disagree with me will be listening in, because we need to be having this conversation as civilized adults here in the United States facing intractable problems. The problem that we're facing right now primarily is that government just seems to grow and grow and grow no matter what happens, no matter who's in office. Maybe it grows more slowly, maybe it grows more quickly, but it just grows. And we all know that. And as we go through the motions of opposing it, we sort of go through these motions with a sense of dreary inevitability, that no matter what we do, the thing is just going to keep on growing. So I want to look at that in light of the 10th Amendment, the Constitution, and liberty in general, what we can do about this. What I can't do tonight is persuade you that the federal government is out of control. I take for granted that people in this room get that it's sort of obvious. I don't have time to go into that. I assume you get that. We have a government that is completely contemptuous of the very idea of constitutional limits on its authority. As far as they're concerned, the Constitution exists to make sure we have a presidential election every 4 years, so we can choose between 2 plastic men every 4 years. That's why it's there. And it's there to make sure that the senators serve 6-year terms and so on and so forth. But we should remember that the British Constitution, which has been around a long time, is an unwritten document. And they have all those things. They've spelled out what offices have what year terms and so on and so forth. You don't need a written constitution for that. What you need a written constitution for is the limitation of government. That's the only reason to have a constitution, not for these structural things. You can have that as a matter of tradition, unwritten. We have a written constitution for the purpose of limiting government. And yet, it's going to be a long night. Because I got much better zingers than that one in store for you guys. But we all know, now, I mean, it's sort of too easy, right? I mean, you know, to throw out Nancy Pelosi's name, it's almost too easy, right? It's like an easy, you know, boo line or applause line or whatever. But when Nancy Pelosi was asked, you know, look, I'm just curious. I just want to know, where in the Constitution do you get the authority to pass this health care bill? I mean, I just want to know, right? I mean, it seems like as a citizen I'm entitled to ask that question. And her response was to laugh and ask the questioner twice, are you serious? And then move on to the next question. So notice, Her Imperial Majesty thinks that she can get away with not, I mean, I would have understood even if she had given like a dumb answer or a really lame answer or an easily refuted answer or anything like that. She gives no answer whatsoever. And in fact, feels put out by the question. Well, that indicates something's wrong. I don't care where you are in the political spectrum. That should indicate to you that something is wrong. The Constitution doesn't just belong to the people in this room. It belongs to every American. Every American should want to know, why is that simple question treated with such contempt? When it's a question that Thomas Jefferson and so many people we admire in American history would have asked as a matter of course. Now, we get told an awful lot that people like us are unreasonable. We want to stick to the strict letter of the Constitution. Don't we know that this is a living, breathing Constitution that changes with the times, man? All right, let's go into that before we get any further. Let's go into this living, breathing Constitution thing. I was on the radio the other day, and one of the people on the radio said to me, you know, a friend of mine said the other day that if you, the radio host, had been in charge, you with your strict construction of the Constitution, why, women would never have had the vote, they were told, the person was told. Well, how do women get the vote? Through a constitutional amendment. Nobody objects to the idea of constitutional amendments, given that the idea of constitutional amendments happens to be in the Constitution. How could you support the Constitution and not support that mechanism when it happens to be in there? We're not objecting to constitutional amendments when we object to a living, breathing Constitution. What are we objecting to? We're objecting to the idea that, hey, we'd like to do X, Y, or Z, but you know what? It's not in the Constitution. But, you know, gosh, it would be a real pain to put it in the Constitution, so let's just go ahead and do it anyway. That's what we're objecting to. That is the problem. I mean, imagine somebody in the middle of a poker game saying, now wait a minute, my two pair beats your full house because I've decided this is a living, breathing poker game that changes with the times. Who would accept that? This is an absurdity. Amendments are fine. The problem comes when, as Jefferson said, you turn the Constitution into a blank piece of paper. You allow it to, you pretend that it authorizes practically everything. Well, then what was the point of having it? Why did we go to all the trouble of drafting it? And let's also remember that Americans fought a war against a living, breathing Constitution. That was the War for Independence. What kind of Constitution did the British have? Did they have a written document, a single written document we could all refer to? No. They had an unwritten Constitution that consisted of custom and tradition. The trouble with it was that what was protected one day was attacked the next day. It was very hard for Americans to have their liberties protected under a regime like that. And so we fought against that, and we're determined to establish a written Constitution so that from now on we could say, now wait a minute, the government does not have this power, and I don't care that today is September 26th and yesterday was September 25th. That doesn't matter. The Constitution remains the same, and it's written down, it's in black and white, so you can refer to it. That was what we wanted as Americans. We were fighting against a Constitution that constantly changed with the times. It changed with the times according to the needs of the government at the time. What we're fighting against when we say we're fighting against a living, breathing Constitution is the idea that judges will simply decide on a day-to-day basis what the Constitution means this week as opposed to last week. That a bunch of unelected, politically well-connected lawyers, which is really all these people are. I mean, forget the superstitious reverence we're supposed to show for them. Waving incense in front of them and bowing down. They're just politically well-connected lawyers. These people are supposed to have a monopoly on telling us what the Constitution means today as opposed to yesterday, regardless of what the text means? No. Jefferson said the Constitution was written in simple English so the average American could understand what it means without being told by some black-robed deity what it means. Now, it does not help that we were all taught in 7th grade that don't worry about what the federal government is doing, all of it's allowed in the Constitution. Because we've got an elastic clause, so-called, the necessary and proper clause. We've got a general welfare clause. We've got a commerce clause. Well, those things I'm not going to talk about tonight, although Chapter 2 of my book, Nullification, gives you the idea of what these things really were supposed to mean. It's not that hard to figure out. I mean, it's not like we have to consult tea leaves or tarot cards. I mean, we can look at the state ratifying conventions and what people thought they were getting themselves into. And nobody, and I mean nobody, thought that the general welfare clause meant the federal government could do anything it thinks will be for the welfare of the people. No one would have agreed with that. Every tyrant who ever lived has claimed that his tyranny was in the interest of the people. No one would have gone for that. And when you look at all the proposed amendments that came out in the first few years to amend the Constitution, and of course we got the Bill of Rights out of that, we don't get one amendment saying, now wait a minute, we better clarify this general welfare clause or the federal government will be able to do anything it wants to. No, because everybody understood it can't possibly mean the federal government can do anything it wants. If it did mean that, said James Madison, who knows a little something about the Constitution, I think, if it did mean that, why does the Constitution bother to list the federal government's powers? If it has all the powers necessary to make us happy and healthy and wealthy and wise, why do you bother then listing, oh, by the way, you can also build buildings and you can also raise armies and so on. Like, why would you bother listing those? Those would be included under just do whatever you think will benefit us. Of course it doesn't mean that. These sorts of interpretations, though, have been foisted on the American people to the point where everyone assumes that more or less the federal government is probably just doing what's good for us and there's no constitutional objection. And a lot of people who want to fight against a federal government that feels like it's an imposition even to have to answer our questions about where its constitutional authority is coming from, a lot of people feel like they've tried everything. I've gone out, I've talked to my friends and neighbors, I've handed out pocket constitutions, I've sponsored conferences, I've written articles, I've written letters to the... I've done it all. What's left to do? And of course, the usual political response is, well, just keep on voting for people who give pretty speeches, and that'll solve it. Well, if that would have solved it, we wouldn't have had this, but it would have been solved 100 years ago. The problem is people give wonderful speeches, I don't dispute that, and then 10 minutes later they stab you in the back. And to me, that is the best part of the Tea Party movement. Now, there are some parts of the Tea Party movement that are already bought and paid for, but there are some independent parts of that Tea Party movement. Like the parts of that Tea Party movement that voted Bob Bennett out of his Senate seat in Utah, even though he was a Republican, because he voted for the bailouts. And the head of the Utah Tea Party was on CNN, and the CNN reporter, of course, is horrified at this, because the whole establishment told us those bailouts were for our own good. We peons aren't even entitled to an opinion on the bailouts. And they asked the head of the Utah Tea Party, do you think it's fair that a man's career should end with one vote? And the answer was beautiful. His career will end with that vote. Perfect. That is exactly the correct answer. Well, there are some people in the Tea Parties who feel like, I have been taken advantage of enough. I've been taken advantage of by people who give speeches in which they try to appeal to my values, and then they get in office and they stab me in the back from day one, and they expect me back home to clap my hands. Well, I'm not doing it anymore. We've got to try something different, because everybody in this room knows that if we just keep on enabling these people, and that's what we're doing. These people are addicts. They're addicted to power. And if we keep enabling them, by just mindlessly supporting them because of their pretty speeches, we all know what's going to happen. We're going to keep getting betrayed. The federal government will keep getting bigger, and then every 2 and 4 years we'll get all the sob stories about the federal government like it didn't happen under their watch. No. Enough people, I think we have reached a critical mass in the society, are prepared to say, no, Dick Morris does not have the answers. We have to think a tiny bit outside that particular box. It is time, I am suggesting, that we return to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was rather more of a genius than almost anyone, well, what am I saying, almost, what an insult, than anybody we've got, well, with maybe one honorable exception in our political life today. Thomas Jefferson was repeatedly a prophet in predicting what was going to happen in American society if we weren't careful. And Jefferson was convinced the federal government is not going to limit itself. You cannot establish an institution like this and then hand it a piece of paper and say, okay, now go limit yourself. What possible incentive does this institution have to limit itself? It's not going to happen. It wants to cater to special interests and sell votes, and has no interest whatsoever in staying limited. So therefore, said Jefferson, something outside the federal government has to do the limiting. Common sense. You can't expect this thing to limit itself. Now, we talk a lot about the 10th Amendment. That indeed is the theme of our meeting tonight. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that whatever powers the states have not delegated to the federal government and are not prohibited to them by the Constitution are reserved to the states and the people. That's what the 10th Amendment says. It's a self-government amendment. It's an amendment that makes sure that the whole reason we fought the American Revolution isn't going to be flushed down the toilet. The point of fighting the American Revolution wasn't that Britain is too far away, and if only we had a closer oppressor, we'd be happier. What in the world is the point of that? No, the idea was local self-government. That was what the American Revolution was fought about, and that's what the 10th Amendment is all about. And yet, the 10th Amendment is already implicit in the Constitution as drafted even before there was a 10th Amendment. It's already implicit in the Constitution. How do we know that? Well, we take James Madison's advice and we look for our interpretation of the Constitution to the state ratifying conventions. What did the people who voted on this document think they were getting themselves into? This is a general legal principle. If I'm a judge and I want to determine the true meaning of a will, I want to determine the intentions of the testator. Likewise, with this Constitution, what were the intentions of those who willingly got themselves into it? And we see in state after state after state, the supporters of the Constitution assured the state conventions that this federal government would have only the powers expressly, and yes, they used the word expressly delegated to it. So the 10th Amendment is merely codifying what skeptics of the Constitution were told was already implicit in that document. Thomas Jefferson says that the 10th Amendment is the cornerstone of the Constitution. And yet today, the 10th Amendment is an object of ridicule. You're some type of extremist if you want to support the 10th Amendment. Maybe we have to put you on some sort of watch list because you believe in decentralized government, because you believe in a humane scale of political life. Ooh, terrible. My gosh, what other horrible things might you have buried deep in your soul? Well, what's happened to the 10th Amendment today? If you have the misfortune of studying for the bar exam, you're a prospective lawyer, and you happen to take one of these sort of crash courses where you sort of study how to take the bar exam and you take practice tests and they give you test-taking tips, this is not a joke. I've got this on good authority from several people who have done the test and taken these test preparation courses. One of the tips is, when you're taking the multiple choice section, if you see a question, one of whose multiple choice responses is the 10th Amendment, you can cross that out. Because the 10th Amendment is never the right answer on the bar exam. It is always wrong. Because the 10th Amendment means nothing today. The cornerstone of the Constitution, it means nothing, and you are suspect and some kind of an extremist or a bad guy even to raise the issue. That's what's happened. So even though you can cite Thomas Jefferson and practically the whole world at the time, that's not enough because Hillary Clinton and Mitch McConnell have a little disagreement with you. I mean, really, I think I'll take me and Thomas Jefferson against anybody, any day, on an issue like this. So I indeed have an uphill battle because what I'm talking about is the powers of the states as checks on the federal government. Because again, the federal government won't limit itself. It has to be limited by something other than itself. And according to Jefferson, who is the logical candidate to carry out this limiting? The states. We've come to associate the powers of the states with disreputable causes. And I'll talk about that later because I'm also going to entertain possible objections to what I'm saying. And as a libertarian, I hold no brief for the states. I'm perfectly willing to concede that the states half the time are also run by sociopaths. I don't deny that. I mean, just look around you in some of the states. My gosh, the things people suffer under. But the point is, by thinking this way, by taking this sort of seventh grade view of American history and adopting it as the official view with a little trademark symbol beside it, much important American history has simply fallen down the Orwellian memory hole. People think states' rights, well, that's all about slavery. Well, we'll talk about that later. Slavery was never defended by means of the mechanism that I'm going to propose to you tonight. So this is entirely mythological. But when we think in terms of the states as being something stupid that you would want to support, I mean, again, only a would-be oppressor would ever turn to the states. We all know that everything progressive comes from the federal government, blah, 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 blah. It becomes impossible to understand, even to understand our own founding fathers then. Were they just stupid rubes? I mean, like, can't we at least try to show enough sympathy for them to get inside their heads and understand why they believed what they believe? We have fallen victim to a suffocating nationalism that looks superstitiously to one city to govern 300 million people. And we never stop to think about the dehumanizing assumptions we're making. Why should 300 million diverse people be governed by one city and have precious little input into the laws that govern their lives? Why is this question never even raised? It's not raised on the left, it's not raised on the right, it's not talked about. Oh, we have lots of time to talk about trivial issues that involve nothing. Plenty of time for that. Fundamental issues, never. Not to be raised. Citizen, you are not entitled to an opinion on such questions because such questions are not supposed to be considered. The left is the worst offender of all, of course, because when you look back in the old days, I mean, there are times when you actually long for the older style left. Kirkpatrick Sale, who's still alive, has been writing books for decades, and he wrote a book years and years, decades ago, called Human Scale. And a lot of what's in Human Scale is something you would expect from the left. You know, business is too big, this is too big. But he also says political units have grown too big. It is possible for political units to be too big, to get to a point at which they become dysfunctional. And in order for us to live on a human scale, they need to be scaled back so that we can live a humane existence. Well, this kind of thinking has completely disappeared from the left. The left now, their view is, we got to do whatever the central authority tells us. And if you dispute that, well, again, we got to put you on the watch list. Remember when the left used to ask, question authority? Remember, that was their slogan, question authority. You know, see, to me, that has a better ring to it than shut up and obey, which is their new slogan. So let's start with some history. Let's look at 1798, a seminal year, critical year in American history. Because in that year, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. And among other things, that legislation said that it was a crime to criticize the president or Congress. A crime. You could go to jail for it. And indeed, newspaper editors went to jail. A U.S. congressman who fought in the war for independence, who risked his life for the independence of this country, went to jail because he thought John Adams was a little pompous. Well, gee, so does half the world, for heaven's sake. He goes to jail for this. His own constituents took up a collection to pay his fine, and they re-elected him to Congress from jail. Isn't that beautiful? To heck with that stupid law. Now let's remember, this was at a time when in the old days, the way elections worked was if you get the top number of votes, you're the top vote getter, you become the president. And if you're the second highest vote getter, you become the vice president. Oh, well, it leads to a lot of interesting odd couple sort of scenarios, doesn't it? I mean, right, you got John Adams and James Madison in the same, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in the same administration. Funny. Well, notice the way the Sedition Act is worded. If you criticize the president, you're in big trouble. If you criticize the Congress, you're in big trouble. Notice they skipped somebody. Thomas Jefferson, you can criticize him all you want, nothing happens. Well, Jefferson, wasn't a dummy, so he kind of noticed that there seemed to be rather a partisan flavor to this legislation. So he writes to James Madison about this. They strike up a correspondence. They say, my gosh, what in the world is happening to this country? The Constitution was ratified 10 freaking years ago, and already this is going on? I mean, I'm pretty sure the Constitution forbids this. I'm pretty sure. What do we do about it? And I know you would love to read the correspondence between Jefferson and Madison at a time of constitutional crisis. We'd all love to read that correspondence, but you know why we can't read it? Because it doesn't exist. And you know why it doesn't exist? Because Thomas Jefferson, the Vice President of the United States, was concerned that his mail was being opened and tampered with. The Vice President was not safe in expressing his own opinions. And he said, I know not which is worse, that I should fear to express my opinions, or that my country should tolerate such a state of things. Well, what they did decide to do was to propose a series of resolutions to the legislature of Virginia, and then Jefferson originally intended the legislature of North Carolina, but by a series of interesting happenstances, it turned out to be the legislature of Kentucky. These documents became known as the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, and the principles on which they are based became known as the Principles of 98. Now you read them, and in the Virginia Resolutions of 1798, drafted by James Madison, it says that when the federal government goes beyond its constitutional powers, the states are duty-bound to resist. Duty-bound to resist. Not, flip a coin and if it comes up heads, you should resist. Duty-bound to resist. Now, for anybody who, by the way, if there's anybody watching who says, now wait a minute, didn't Madison retract that 32 years later or something? I address that in the book, and the arguments for that are not very strong. I rather suggest this is the effects of advanced age taking over Madison, because I've got huge evidence regarding this. But duty-bound to resist. Thomas Jefferson drafts the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. In his original draft, he says, what is the rightful remedy when the federal government goes beyond its constitutional powers? Do we just vote them out? Well, voting them out might work if they've done something unwise. But if they do something illegal, they do something unconstitutional, well, then they've done something. If they pass an unconstitutional law, it's not a law at all. If it violates the Constitution, it's not a law at all. So how can we enforce it? How can we wait 2 years till there's an election, whatever? We might all be in jail by then, for all we know. And secondly, elections don't always solve things. You might have noticed people sometimes vote for bad guys in elections. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem. No, what we need to do is take action immediately. And what is that action? Well, Jefferson said in his original draft that a nullification of the unconstitutional laws is the rightful remedy. And in follow-up resolutions the following year, the Kentucky legislature adopted that formulation. A nullification is the rightful remedy. So this isn't something we made up in this room, or I made this up, or I got drunk last night and thought, wouldn't this be neat? This comes out of Jefferson. In 1800, early 1800, we get what's called the Report of 1800, sometimes called the Virginia Report or Madison's Report. James Madison composes a report, a follow-up report, following up on the Virginia Resolutions of 1798. And in that report, he reiterates those principles, and he says, we need to have a remedy for when even the judicial branch betrays us. Because we're told, well, let the courts decide. Aren't the courts there to decide? Well, the thing is, the courts are not composed of infallible human beings, because there is no such thing. Moreover, the courts are themselves part of the problem in Jefferson's view. Jefferson's view was the federal courts are going to typically rubber stamp what the federal government does. Well, hello, there he is, a prophet, number 1587, incident of his prophecies. Of course, that's exactly what's happened. I mean, look today. Look, what do the federal courts do today? Are they studiously monitoring the federal government? No, apparently they're all done with that. Now they spend all their time going after the states because they've already gone after all the unconstitutional federal laws. I mean, it's a joke. And Jefferson knew it was a joke at the time. He said, how could the federal courts be impartial arbiters in disputes over power between the federal government and the states when they're part of the federal government? If I'm having a dispute with you, and I say, I've got just the person to adjudicate this dispute, my mother, wouldn't you think you were sort of being had? Now, that's not to say that my mother would never side with you. Once in a while she might. But, I wouldn't count on it happening a lot of times. I've known my mother for, rather a long time, more than, longer than anyone else has known me. That was his point. So we need to have some other remedy. What is that remedy? It is state nullification. Now, this is the most unfashionable thing you can say, practically, in public life today. Oh my gosh, how dare you say that? How dare you want to nullify what our wise public servants are doing because they're elected to Washington just to serve us. They're not there serving special interests. They're not there selling out. They're not there shoveling money to powerful and influential people. No. My 6th grade civics book tells me they're there representing us. Okay, time to close the 6th grade civics book and look around you and observe the actual government we're living under, so that you might have some sense of what's really going on. So this was Jefferson's answer. The states created the federal government. They are the principles to the constitutional compact. The federal government is just the agent of the states. Since when does an agent tell the principals what to do? Since when does an employee tell his employer what to do? This is not the natural order of things. So we need the states to be the arbiters of constitutionality in the last resort. Now, parenthetically, let's suppose you came across this objection, which you will get once in a while. People will say, okay, I understand the first 13 states did indeed establish the Constitution. They sent delegates to a constitutional convention. Then that Constitution was sent around for their ratification. But what about the other 37 states? Didn't the U.S. government create those 37 states? So how can you say the states create? This is all wrong, right? And at least the next 37, you've got it backwards. Well, this is about as wrong can be. And I'll just give you the quick reason why it's wrong. The American understanding of states versus the federal government is not that the federal government creates the states. This is anathema to Americans. The idea, rather, is that the people create the states. The people draft a state constitution, and then they apply for admission to the Union. And so, for example, when Thomas Jefferson was interested in the subject of the admission of Missouri to the Union in 1820. You had a case where Missouri had drafted a state constitution. And Jefferson said to them, if you are not admitted to membership in the Union, then you will simply be an independent state. So notice, your statehood does not rely on approval by the federal government. It comes from the sovereignty of the people of the state. So this objection does not, in fact, work. Now, where did Jefferson get these ideas? Maybe Jefferson was drunk. Right? I mean, maybe he just had a bad night and he woke up really angry, all hungover, and he wrote out the Kentucky resolutions, right? And so, maybe he just had a bad day, which is what some historians try to claim. Well, this is just a weird anomaly in Jefferson's thinking. That is so wrong. It is so not a weird anomaly in Jefferson's thinking. And in fact, to the contrary, you know where Jefferson gets this from? Not from his own brain, but he gets it from the Virginia Ratifying Convention of 1788. 1788, Virginia is considering, should we ratify the Constitution or not? And there are debates back and forth, and there are skeptics of the Constitution in that state ratifying convention, including Patrick Henry, who says, now, wait a minute. There are clauses in this Constitution that I'm afraid that ambitious politicians will interpret in such a way as to give themselves unlimited power. Now, what are we going to do to stop that? Now, what was Patrick Henry told? Now, remember, Virginia is probably the most important of the early states, right? I mean, what state produces more of our most important statesmen than Virginia? What is Patrick Henry told? Well, there was a 5-man commission that was given the task of drafting the document by which Virginia would ratify the Constitution. So this 5-man commission is, kind of important. Edmund Randolph, future Attorney General, sitting on that commission. And he says to Patrick Henry, don't worry. This federal government is going to be a very limited government. It's going to be limited to those powers that are expressly delegated to it. So again, he uses the phrase expressly delegated. This is not a phrase you or I made up. So again, it's a limited government. George Nicholas, who becomes the first Attorney General of Kentucky, says, oh, and by the way, what happens if the federal government reaches for some additional power that is not granted to it in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution? What happens then? He assured his fellow Virginians, well, what happens then is that Virginia is exonerated from this supplementary power because we never consented to it. We're consenting only to the powers listed in Article 1, Section 8. So don't worry. If the federal government goes beyond, in some statute that it passes, the powers delegated to it, all we need to do is point to that statute and say, not in Virginia. Well, that's pretty darn close to state nullification. And even with that assurance given to them by the most significant members of that ratifying convention, they still barely voted to ratify the Constitution. Now, all the things I've told you thus far are available in sources that are easily consulted. The proceedings of the state ratifying convention of Virginia are sitting there collecting dust on library shelves. You can look at my book, Nullification, look up the footnotes and track it for yourselves. This is all sitting there. How many school kids learn this stuff? Could we round it off to 0, perhaps? Nothing. Nothing. You hear crickets in the background. It said absolutely nothing. Now, one thing we get told, because lately some states have started to revive talk about state nullification, and of course the political establishment has just reacted the way they would to the return of Godzilla. You know, I mean, like, oh my gosh, who do these uppity people think they are? I mean, we haven't approved this idea. How dare they think it? And so one of the things we get told is, no, you can't support this idea that the states can refuse to enforce an unconstitutional law, that they should just sit back and wait till the year 2850 when there's a good Supreme Court and whatever. You know, that's a strategy they should pursue. You know, we get told that all the time. But yet, the argument they make is, look at 1798, 1799. What did other states say about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions? And the states that responded to those resolutions, that advocated nullification, those states, like a lot of northern states, for example, were appalled at Virginia and Kentucky and said, how dare you resist the federal government? And so we're told, for example, there's a law professor, Sanford Levinson, who was appalled that the idea of nullification was raised in the Texas gubernatorial race. Who are these uppity citizens who think they can stand up to their wise overlords who graduated from Harvard and are ruling them from Washington? How dare they? And Levinson wrote this article saying, look, northern states were dead set against these documents. So, you know, I guess they're just stupid. Okay, I'm going to leave it to you as to whether we're dealing with malice or ignorance. Because let's look at why. Let's investigate why did those northern states oppose Virginia and Kentucky's resistance to laws that clearly violated the First Amendment. Why were they against them? Read what they said. Again, these documents are sitting right there. What does Massachusetts say, my home state? Massachusetts says the Sedition Act that makes it a crime punishable by imprisonment to criticize the president and Congress, and to criticize them, by the way, in terms that today we would consider incredibly restrained. Massachusetts said this is a wise law. This is good and wise. Well, Massachusetts was dominated by Federalists, and guess which party dominated Washington at that time? Of course, the Federalists. So of course Massachusetts is against people resisting this. They support the law, as did countless other northern states, as I show in the book. So don't come around and tell me that the validity of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions depends on states that are so constitutionally brain dead that they think not only is it constitutionally acceptable, but it's positively wise to impose a law putting people in jail for saying John Adams is a pompous jerk. I'm supposed to rethink Virginia and Kentucky for standing up to this? That makes me respect them all the more. Don't tell me about these objections from the northern states, especially when you leave out of the discussion, as of course Professor Levinson does, predictably, what were the northern states doing just 10 years later? 10 freaking years later. What are they doing? They are appealing to these principles of 1798 to resist what they deemed to be an unconstitutional embargo imposed on their shipping that was destroying their maritime economy, and the unconstitutional searches and seizures that were imposed on their ships. Interesting. So suddenly, these principles are okay. But this is left out of the discussion. Well, actions speak louder than words. I don't care what they said in 1798, 1799. I don't care about some letter they wrote. I care about what they did. And when they were faced with a federal government they thought was out of control, they said, no, we're not going along. The Frankenstein monster does not tell Dr. Frankenstein what to do. We are not going along. And there is example after example of this, again, that I chronicle in the book. This is history that has fallen down the Orwellian memory hole. However, thanks to the internet and all of you good folks who are determined to learn the truth, who don't want to learn some comic book version of American history, who are willing to concede that maybe they learned the wrong thing or an incomplete version of American history in 4th grade, you people happen to have very long, retractable arms. You can reach down into that Orwellian memory hole and pull out parts of American history that we're supposed to forget. We're not even supposed to know about them, much less discuss them. Now, some people will say, one objection, isn't this all about slavery? Every time you talk about the states, it's all really about slavery. Because a lot of Americans today are sitting around the dinner table thinking, how could I bring slavery back? Because that seems like something really desirable and politically feasible. So let me get the pro-slavery constituency going. I mean, how much of an emotional hypochondriac could you be to think that slavery is something anyone would want to see return or it has anything whatsoever to do with this? But okay, I can understand people think states' rights means slavery. I understand that because, again, we all learned that in junior high. Everybody learned that. Well, as I've just shown you, the northern states used these principles of 98 for perfectly honorable purposes. They used the states to resist unconstitutional laws by the federal government. And indeed, Jefferson and Madison were urging resistance by the states to unconstitutional laws, none of which had anything whatsoever to do with slavery. And to the contrary, not only was nullification never, and I mean never, used to defend slavery, it was used to fight against slavery. If you look at the northern states, particularly after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a lot of them are doing everything in their power to obstruct the enforcement of that unspeakable law. Now you may say that required northern states to return runaway slaves to their masters. Now you may say, now wait a minute, Woods. Isn't there a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution? Regrettable though it may be, isn't it in fact in there? Well, there is indeed, but many northern states thought that that does not mean the federal government can use any means whatsoever to go after runaway slaves. There were states that said, you know what, we don't like and we object to the idea that some southern slave owner could come into our state and say, here's a physical description of the slave that ran away from my plantation, and hey, you know what, that guy over there kind of looks like him. I think I'll take him with me. A lot of states said, you know what, I have a funny feeling that that system is open to a teensy-weensy bit of abuse. And as states, we have the responsibility to protect our people against potential kidnapping. So no one is being taken out of this state without being given a jury trial first. And there was no state that was more heroic in this than Wisconsin, whose legislature in 1859 quoted Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions of 1798 and the follow-up ones of 1799, 60 years after they were drafted, to say that we are not obligated to enforce an unconstitutional law, and indeed we are obligated to resist it. Now, again, this is history that has been forgotten. You look in Wisconsin's history, you see that for years leading up to that great culmination in 1859, people are handing out flyers and handbills saying, look, we're going to have a giant rally here in Milwaukee, standing up for the powers of our states to protect the innocent against the incursions of a federal government that knows no constitutional limits. The states standing up for poor blacks who had no one to stand up for them. This is gone from our history. Now, of course it's gone. Of course, if you wanted to exercise absolute power, what version of U.S. history would you want to peddle? Well, one in which, of course, the states are always evil, the federal government is always a progressive force, only a jerk or a would-be Hitler would want to stand up to the federal government. Of course you'd want to pass off that version of history. Unfortunately, it happens not to be true. And it's long past time that we resurrected the real version, not the comic book version, of American history. In fact, look at South Carolina's Ordinance of Secession, December 20th, 1860. Notice what they're complaining about, because we get a lot about, this had something to do with the Civil War. I don't know what they're talking about. People have read like half a sentence, and they say, wasn't the Civil War all about this? Well, yes, but in the complete opposite way from what people think. What does South Carolina complain about in its Ordinance of Secession? That the North is nullifying too many laws. You talk about nullification today, and people say, oh, that's some crazy Confederate idea. What are you, some kind of evil Confederate who wants to enslave people? I mean, again, this is the sort of Pravda propaganda we have to deal with here. Like, people won't even have an honest debate with you. They just reduce it to this sort of Pravda kind of language. But in fact, look at the reality. The reality is the South is upset that the North is nullifying. That the North is nullifying the fugitive slave laws. So this is not a Southern doctrine. This is not a Northern doctrine. It's an American one. This was the point of the American Revolution, to create a society that consisted of a collection of self-governing communities, not one single consolidated whole. The world was lousy with those. The world already had 1 million of those, where the government of France dictates to all of France. The world already had that. The United States was trying to be a little bit unique, and we've thrown this legacy away completely. Now let's deal with some of the objections. Some objections you hear raised to these sorts of ideas would be as follows. Well, if we resurrected this sort of idea, wouldn't some states nullify some laws and some states nullify other laws? Now, my old answer to this question used to run as follows, that, well, I actually think it's much more likely that the states are going to be too timid to do this. That maybe they'd nullify one or two things. I think they're going to be too timid to do it, I fear. So I actually think you're worried about the wrong thing. Or my other answer would be, well, look, we've got two potential difficulties here. We got states that might nullify a lot of laws, or we got a federal government that acts without limits. Which one do you pick? Well, we've lived through the second one, and it's led us to the situation we're in now, which is, we're facing impossible to pay debts. It's a mess. I'm not so worried about the federal government, which won't find enough powers to sustain itself. It seems to have seen its way through over the years. It seems to have stumbled along quite all right. I'm not too worried about that. That's not the thing I'm worried about. I'm more worried about local self-government. But no. I say to heck with those answers. Those are lame answers. My answer to the idea that maybe some states will do some things and some will do others, my answer is, so what? That is the United States that the framers of the Constitution tried to give us. A group of self-governing communities. And yes, Vermont might be different from Texas, which is different from North Dakota, which is different from Maryland. So what? That's what differentiates it from every lousy regime that exists in the whole freaking world. Can't we have some respite from centralized government somewhere? And moreover, I would say to people on the progressive left that you and we should be having the arguments we're having face to face, like gentlemen, at the state level, instead of delegating everything to some institution hundreds of miles away that doesn't know anything about us, doesn't care about us. I mean, you really think the U.S. Senate is really concerned about us? I mean, what winds up happening is that the U.S. federal government winds up doing things that nobody's happy with. A genuine progressive, I'm not talking about the phony balonies on MSNBC. A genuine progressive was against the bank bailouts, just like a genuine conservative or libertarian was against them. But that's the sort of thing we get when we just throw off all responsibilities on this federal government. It's responsive to no one. We make calls 2,000 to 1 against, and they do it anyway. Part of the job description of being a U.S. Senator is ignoring the American people. Let's have these battles where they belong, at the state level. And yes, some states might be different from other states, but wasn't the left supposed to believe small is beautiful and all this stuff? Why do they make an exception to small is beautiful, to say small is beautiful, however 300 million people ruled by one city, that's A-okay? No, sorry, that's inconsistent. Let's get a little consistency here. Second objection. What about the supremacy clause of the Constitution? Doesn't Article 6 say, and as you hear endlessly in the media when they even deign to discuss the subject, they'll say, well, federal law trumps state law. Really? That's what I would give you an F if you thought that's what the Constitution says. What does the supremacy clause actually say? It says, and I'm paraphrasing, that the Constitution and laws in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. Well, nobody who supports state nullification denies that. That's not the issue. The issue is this particular law that we're confronted with, is this one in pursuance of the Constitution? That's the issue. Nobody denies that a constitutional law is indeed the supreme law of the land. The question is this one constitutional? So citing the supremacy clause simply begs the question. It shows you don't even understand the nature of the debate we're having. So, for example, imagine proposing the Constitution to the states, and it had a clause in it that says, the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, plus whatever all laws, constitutional or not, we may choose to pass. Who in his right mind would ratify a document like that? No one understood it to mean that. Of course, it doesn't mean that. The point is that unconstitutional laws are not the supreme law of the land, and that's precisely what we're saying. Another objection. Didn't the Civil War settle all this? Now, I alluded to this earlier. Didn't the Civil War settle this? Well, first of all, the Civil War was not about nullification, except in the completely opposite way in which I indicated earlier. But let's take this argument seriously, though, because this is a seriously Orwellian argument. Because even if the Civil War had been about nullification, since when are philosophical and historical disagreements resolved not by reason, argument, and evidence, but by violence? I mean, would we really say, if the Plains Indians came along and had some objection, would we really say, well, hey, wait a minute, wasn't this whole issue resolved by the U.S. Army? I mean, would we really say that? I mean, if you and I were having a dispute, and you said 2 + 2 = 5, or pardon me, I'll make you guys the ones who are right. You say 2 + 2 = 4, and I say 2 + 2 = 5, and then I just punch you all in the face. Does that make 2 + 2 5? I mean, like, what if you came to me the next day and said, look, I want to start up this discussion here. I mean, I think you're wrong about 2 + 2 = 5. What would you make of it if I said to you, hey, wait a minute, I thought that was settled, but I knocked you out yesterday. I mean, didn't we settle that? 2 + 2 obviously is 5, right? Or why would you be lying on the ground? I mean, come on. Let's argue this on the merits. Let's not argue this on some crazy Stalinist, Orwellian sort of way of arguing. Now, but then there is a serious objection. I mean, I don't want to make light of this, that no one could have a legitimate objection to what I'm saying. And so I could very easily understand somebody saying, well, what about the civil rights movement? I mean, don't we here have a clear-cut case in which the states are oppressing people? Well, I don't dispute that at all. I mean, blacks were suffering unbelievable indignities in many states. I think hardly anybody disputes that today. And again, I don't per se support the states per se. I support them as bulwarks against the federal government, but I don't then say that whatever they do is just super duper and I'm sure it'll be great and they'll never make any mistakes. I mean, you guys all know that sometimes state officials are pretty rotten too. But what I want to suggest is that to talk about civil rights and compare it to what we're talking about today, which is the revival of these ideas as a mechanism, given that every other mechanism has been a complete, unmitigated failure and disaster, reviving these ideas as a mechanism of resistance against the federal government, I want to suggest that this is apples and oranges because how was it possible to impose this sort of oppressive regime on American blacks living in the South? Well, it was possible because by and large blacks didn't have the right to vote. So they're not a voting bloc, so it's very easy to ignore them, to spit on them, to treat them like garbage and so on. Very easy to do that. It's very interesting to note, Michael Klarman is a professor at the University of Virginia. He wrote a book that won the Bancroft Prize, which is awarded by Columbia University. And in that book, talking about these very issues, he noted that when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was decided in 1954, it was not in the wake of this decision that things began to change in the South. Things moved very slowly in the wake of that decision. When did things really begin to change? In 1965, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then suddenly things moved. So now everybody's got the right to vote. The constitutional remedy to that problem was indeed applied. So I think it is not fair to say, well, today the same sort of thing would happen. How? In fact, look at the past 30 years, past 3 decades. Look at the demographics. What section of the country have American blacks been moving to? Had they been moving to New York and Philadelphia? No, like most Americans, they've been getting the heck out of those places. No, where have they been going? They've been going to the South consistently. What section of the country is the only one in which a majority of blacks polled say they believe they are treated fairly? It's the South. It is not Birmingham 1963 anymore, and it is unfair to continue to express this sort of bigotry against the many good, decent people who live in the South, who have bent over backwards to repent of their past. We cannot consistently live in 1963. Things have progressed. Things have indeed changed. It is simply unacceptable for people, a lot of them on the left, to continue assuming the worst motives about people who disagree with them. To simply assume that anybody who supports the rights of the states is an evil oppressor. Oh, thank you. Who spends his time, you got 10 spare minutes and you sit and think, gosh, what could I do to oppress minorities? That's how they actually think. People like us think. Why do they think that? Why do they refuse to give us the moral benefit of the doubt? That is not fair. And moreover, nobody seriously thinks that the real threats to American liberty today are coming from Boise, Idaho. They are coming from Washington, D.C. in a million different forms, and we all know it. Moreover, if states' rights were merely a mechanism of oppression, then why has every tyrant who ever lived opposed them? Why was the biggest opponent of states' rights of the whole 20th century Hitler? Now, if you read Mein Kampf, which I guess a lot of us probably don't do, but if you flip through to the states' rights section, you will find that Hitler is really not going for this idea at all. Hitler's argument is, look, I want to impose the Nazi ideology on the whole country. I don't care about your crummy state boundaries. I don't want these stupid states' rights. That would be an obstacle to the spread of the Nazi philosophy. So to heck with it. That's how tyrants speak. Just think. Are the prospects for liberty better or worse if you have one giant jurisdiction or you have a group of small competing jurisdictions? Think of how liberty came to Europe in the modern period. Historians have long wondered, why was it that in Western Europe, first anywhere in the world, that we begin to see sustained economic growth as we move into the modern period? Why do we see that there? Is it merely a coincidence? And a great many historians have reached this consensus regarding what is sometimes referred to as the European miracle. The reason is this, that when the Roman Empire fell, no continent-wide empire emerged to take its place. So Europe was characterized by a patchwork of tiny little jurisdictions. So if any one of those jurisdictions became too oppressive, you could just move 5 feet away and be under the jurisdiction of somebody else. So what incentive does that give the people who rule those tiny places? Not to be too oppressive, because you're going to lose your whole tax base. Everybody's just going to get the heck out of there. And it turns out that in fact, the very absence of a single overarching political authority, that is what made liberty possible in Western Europe. Again, this is stuff that is just gone. It's forgotten. But this is real. This exists. You can look at reputable historians who point all this out. And yet, since the age of nationalism and the rise of large, so-called indivisible nation-states, citizens of these regimes have been taught to believe that political centralization is a self-justifying goal, an end in itself. We never even think outside these suffocating intellectual constraints. 300 million people ruled by one city? Sure. Only a crank would object to that. Or how about this? How about this sort of thing that no one ever thinks about? We focus on all the trivial issues that the New York Times wants us to waste our time about, but fundamental things never. So, for example, wouldn't the world have been better off if Germany had indeed remained a group of decentralized collection of states? Who is such a fanatical nationalist as to say, nope, Germany had to be centralized, and the Holocaust and the 50 million deaths of World War II was just the price we had to pay? Who would be so morally stunted as to say something like that? But we never even consider this question. Centralization is an end in itself, and we'll just deal with the consequences. Well, the 20th century shows us what the consequences are. And it's totalitarian revolutions and total war and genocide. Why does this institution deserve the benefit of the doubt? And why is it that people on the left and the right who support political decentralization, why are they on the defensive? People who support this institution, the modern centralized state, which is the most murderous, the most lethal institution that has ever existed in history, should, in a sane world, be the ones on the moral defensive. No monarch ever had the power that 20th century leaders have enjoyed. These monarchs were hemmed in by competing social authorities, provinces, states, churches, each of which had rights and liberties of its own that they were prepared to defend. Society was broken up into multiple power centers, whereas today every one of us takes for granted, because it is the consensus of modern political philosophy, it is the consensus of our political establishment, that it was good for all this to be swept aside, and that society must be organized with a single irresistible power at the center. But again, look at the destruction, the piles of corpses that no monarch could ever have had the power to get away with. So hemmed in was he by competing power centers, instead of the single irresistible power center that we are convinced is the only way society can be organized. Why? Why do we react so violently, repeating cliches from 7th grade when another way of thinking is raised? Why is it so hard to see what should be clear as day? That we should not give the moral benefit of the doubt to this institution. As I said, the U.S. was not intended to be just another run-of-the-mill centralized state. It was supposed to be a collection of self-governing communities. In fact, it used to be customary in the United States and Europe to say the United States are a wonderful place to live. Are a wonderful place to live. The emphasis being on the plurality of self-governing communities. Again, given that the world was lousy with centralized states. We already have 1 million of those. We don't need another one. But instead, we are governed by, let's call it what it is, a centralized plutocracy that I can't believe really an authentic progressive, of which there seem to be like 7 left, or a traditional conservative or libertarian could support. This institution needs to be limited by something outside itself, and that is what Jefferson intended with nullification. Now, what I also propose is that as a supplement to nullification, because nullification cannot answer all our problems, needless to say, but how about this? It's not the same thing, but it bears a family resemblance. What if we had this rule? That if a simple majority of the states, so 26 states, and it doesn't matter the mechanism they use, it could be their attorney general, it could be their state legislature, it could be a popular referendum, the method doesn't matter. But if 26 states declared that a federal law was unconstitutional, it would therefore be repealed. Now imagine if we had that reform. Now, why do I say that bears a resemblance to nullification? Because the idea is that something other than the federal government itself would be doing the limiting. Like, we've already experimented with this federal government, you go limit yourself experiment. That didn't work, and Jefferson warned us it wouldn't work, and, for the zillionth time he was right. Why don't we try this? Why don't we at least talk about this? Now, I'm happy to say, things that I've been talking about, I did indeed put in the book Nullification. A lot of you have copies. I'm very glad for the endorsements I have on the back cover. Because this is, again, this is not in the mainstream, so-called, right? We're all supposed to bow before the mainstream. Ooh, pardon me, right? I've diverged from what Newsweek tells me I'm allowed to think. Oh, heaven forbid. But so it is particularly brave for people to endorse a book like this. But by the way, I think that the book is just common sense. But today, common sense is like crazy wacko, whereas crazy wacko has become mainstream. So it's a upside-down, topsy-turvy world. But it's nice to see Walter Williams endorsing this, who's Rush Limbaugh's sit-in host, great professor of economics. The most fearless man on television, Judge Andrew Napolitano, of course, doesn't hesitate to endorse this at all. And of course, Congressman Goldwater himself. It's a great honor to have him as well. A lot of people on conservative radio and whatever are hesitating to talk about this. Now, as it picks up, and I've been all over the country, and there are state legislatures so ready to go with this. Once it picks up, all these radio hosts will pretend that they were driving the bandwagon all along. You can be sure of that. But the momentum is building across the country. 5 years ago, when the Real ID Act was passed, and this was something that fiscal conservatives and civil libertarians joined hands against, about 24 states basically said, well, we're just not doing this. So, what are you going to do? You're going to send in the tanks to 24 states? I mean, come on. What are you going to do? And so it was either this year or last year, Janet Napolitano, no relation to the heroic judge, of course, Janet Napolitano said, the reason that the Real ID Act failed is that the states refused to go along with it. Wonderful. A model for the future indeed. Now, a brief word, just quickly, about California and the medical marijuana thing. Now, I don't know what people think in this room. There could be people who are against the medical marijuana law. That's not relevant. What I'm interested in is the structural question of states and the federal government. It's interesting that when that subject of California's medical marijuana law went to the Supreme Court, 3 of the most conservative states in the Union, I think it was Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, actually filed amicus briefs in support of California. And they said, we think California's law is totally stupid, but the Constitution gives you the right to be stupid. They can be stupid, we can be non-stupid, and people can sort themselves out according to where they want to live. So even conservative states were saying, look, they clearly under the Constitution, some states are going to do some things we don't like. They do have the power to do this. But what's interesting is the Supreme Court said to California, you can't do this. And then later the Ninth Circuit said, when they tried to retry the case on different grounds, Ninth Circuit said, you can't do this. The Justice Department said, you can't do this. And California said, well, thanks for letting us know, and they kept on doing it. So it goes to show that if there is enough resistance, if there's a critical mass of the population that is prepared to say no, it will not happen. Now, in my book, Nullification, I give the example of Wisconsin in the 1850s. They repeatedly defied the U.S. Supreme Court that they believed was engaged in unbelievable crimes against individual liberty. And they said, no, in this state, maybe we're going to lose in the long run, but we're going to fight a heroic fight on behalf of individual liberty in the state of Wisconsin. And what we see is that the federal government at all levels was stunned at the degree of resistance. And every year at the polls, when people were up for office and they said, I'm going to continue to support Wisconsin's stand, they won. So the people supported them, and Wisconsin was able to make this stand. Well, this is being picked up by a lot of people who are deciding that, I've been fooled enough times. I'm not just going to be taken in by the next wave of politicians. Maybe there are a few good ones, I don't know. But Reagan used to quote the old Russian proverb, trust but verify. This is the verify part, the power of state nullification. So indeed it is time to try something else. And yes, it's true, you're going to be smeared and attacked by Keith Olbermann, and he's going to be unhappy. That's true. Because, why? This is an unapproved opinion, citizen. Neither the New York Times nor MSNBC has said you're allowed to hold it. So how dare you? But you know what? When people say you're out of the mainstream, what does that actually mean? The mainstream consists of a continuum of thinkers, and I use the term thinkers extremely liberally, ranging from, let's say, Hillary Clinton to Mitch McConnell. Like this is the 3-inch area that constitutes the mainstream. You know what's mainstream? $100 trillion in unfunded entitlement liabilities. That's what the mainstream has gotten us. You know what's mainstream? In 2020, assuming interest rates don't rise, interest payments on the national debt alone will be almost $1 trillion a year. That's mainstream. These mainstream so-called people have screwed up this country almost beyond repair. So who wants to be part of this bunch of corrupt and ignorant ignoramuses who we laughingly call the mainstream? We are the mainstream. We are the ones who make the common sense observation that if something cannot continue forever, it won't. And indeed, what the federal government has done and all its fancy programs are going to come to an end, and it's going to be ugly because no one's prepared for it. Everybody believes that the experts are in charge and somehow everything will turn out all right. Everybody models himself after Homer Simpson the day he has to take his nuclear physics exam, in which his test-taking strategy is that the day of the test, I will hide under some coats and hope that somehow everything works out. Well, it ain't. It ain't going to work out. The mainstream has set us up for an economic disaster. And that's leaving out all the other fiascos, non-economic fiascos we have to deal with. So yeah, you're going to be called lots of names by people who feel threatened by ideas that they didn't learn in 6th grade. You may have to stand against Chris Matthews and Dick Morris. You may have to stand against the establishment left and the establishment right. But my friends, In so standing, you will be standing with Thomas Jefferson. And that is never a lonely place to be. Thank you very much.